Eleanor Jackson lies motionless in the hospital bed, machines beeping steadily around her. Officer Derek Walters stares at his phone, color draining from his face. The text message glows ominously. Admiral Marcus Jackson arrives tomorrow. He wants answers about his mother's condition. Derek's career, freedom, and life are about to implode. Before we dive into this shocking story of justice and accountability, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Take a second to drop your location in the comments. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves equal treatment under the law, and subscribe to join our community fighting for justice. Now, let's rewind to see how Officer Derek Walters' life began spiraling out of control when he made the worst mistake of his career. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across West Point Harbor as Eleanor Jackson carefully navigated her modest Toyota Camry through the historic district. At 73, the retired schoolteacher still maintained an active schedule, volunteering 3 times weekly at the community garden where she taught local children about sustainable agriculture. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her posture still remarkably straight despite her advancing years. Eleanor hummed softly to a jazz tune on the radio. Satisfied with today's work and looking forward to a quiet evening with her newest mystery novel. The coastal South Carolina community had been her home for over 40 years, through integration. Through raising her son alone after her husband's death in Vietnam, through decades of subtle and not-so-subtle racism that she faced with unwavering dignity. She slowed as she approached a stop sign at Magnolia and Palmetto Streets, coming to a rolling stop before proceeding through the empty intersection. The flash of blue lights in her rearview mirror caught her by surprise. Eleanor sighed deeply, checking her speedometer out of habit though she knew she hadn't been speeding. She guided her car to the curb, turned off the engine, and placed her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, a habit she'd instilled in her son and her students alike when teaching them how to interact with law enforcement. Officer Derek Walters observed the Toyota from his patrol car, running the plates before approaching. 38 years old with a stocky build and close-cropped brown hair. Derek had served with the West Point Harbor Police Department for 12 years. His colleagues knew him as a by-the-book officer, though the black community knew him differently, as someone who seemed to find reasons to pull them over, someone whose hand rested too readily on his weapon, someone whose voice took on a particular edge when addressing them. Derek approached the driver's side window, his sunglasses hiding eyes that had already made assumptions about the elderly black woman behind the wheel. License and registration, he demanded without preamble, without the customary greeting or explanation for the stop. Eleanor turned slightly, her movements deliberate and calm. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Her voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had taught English literature for over 30 years. Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You rolled through that stop sign back there. License and registration, please." Eleanor nodded, reaching slowly for her purse on the passenger seat. "I apologize if it appeared that way, officer. I'm certain I came to a complete stop." Derek watched her movements with unwarranted suspicion. In 12 years on the force, he'd been passed over for promotion twice, most recently losing the sergeant position to a younger black officer. His wife had left him 3 years ago, taking their 2 children to her parents' home in Charleston. The divorce had been finalized last year, with limited visitation that Derek often missed due to his self-requested night shifts. His father had been a police officer in the same department during the segregation era, filling young Derek's head with stories about keeping order in the black neighborhoods. These thoughts simmered beneath the surface as Eleanor handed over her documentation. "Mrs. Jackson," he read from her license, "step out of the vehicle, please." Eleanor's brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Officer, I don't understand. This was a minor traffic violation, if it happened at all. Is stepping out necessary?" Something in her calm questioning triggered a flare of anger in Derek. People like her were always questioning his authority, always thinking they knew better. "Ma'am, When an officer gives you a lawful order, you comply. Step out of the vehicle now. His voice rose sharply on the last word. Eleanor sensed the dangerous shift in his tone. She'd lived long enough, seen enough, to recognize when a situation with authority was deteriorating. Still, 73 years of dignity wouldn't allow her to simply submit to unnecessary intimidation. Officer Walters, she said, reading his nameplate, I'd like to understand why this is necessary. If you're issuing me a citation, I'm happy to sign it, but Derek cut her off. Out of the car. Now. His hand moved to the latch of his holster, an unconscious gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Eleanor. Across the street, a young couple had paused their walk, watching the interaction with growing concern. The woman already had her phone out, recording. Eleanor reached for her own phone in her purse. I'd like to call my son, please. He's in. Derek misinterpreted her movement, his training and prejudice colliding in a fatal moment of panic and aggression. Hands where I can see them, he shouted, yanking the car door open and grabbing Eleanor's arm with punishing force. The sudden movement sent a shock of pain through her arthritic shoulder, causing her to cry out. You're hurting me. Please stop. Eleanor's voice carried the shock of someone unused to being handled violently. Derek dragged her from the vehicle, her slight frame offering little resistance. On the sidewalk now, Eleanor tried to regain her composure, adjusting her cardigan with trembling hands. Officer, I am a 73-year-old woman who has never had so much as a parking ticket. This treatment is completely unwarranted, and I will be filing a formal complaint with your department. The measured dignity in her voice, the implicit challenge to his authority. The gathering audience of onlookers with phones raised, it all combusted in Derek's mind. His face flushed dark with rage. You people always think you're above the law. Always threatening complaints when you don't get special treatment. Eleanor straightened to her full height, righteous indignation overcoming her fear. You people? I've been a respected educator in this community for over 40 years. My son serves this country as a... The punch came without warning. Derek's closed fist connected with Eleanor's face with the full force of his rage and weight behind it. The sickening crack of impact silenced the gasps from onlookers. For a moment, Eleanor remained upright, a look of absolute shock frozen on her features. Then, like a marionette with cut strings, she collapsed backward. The sound of her head striking the concrete was a dull thud that would echo in witnesses' memories for years to come. Blood immediately began pooling beneath her silver hair. Derek stood frozen, his fist still clenched, as if he himself couldn't believe what he'd done. The young woman across the street screamed, her partner already on the phone with 911. He punched her. The cop just punched an old lady. She's not moving. More residents emerged from nearby homes and businesses, phones recording, voices raised in horror and anger. The reality of his actions began to penetrate Derek's shock. He keyed his radio with a shaking hand. This is Officer Walters. I need backup at Magnolia and Palmetto. I have an uncooperative suspect down, medical required. Even as he spoke the words, he knew they were a lie. What lay before him wasn't an uncooperative suspect but an elderly woman. Completely still except for the alarming spread of blood beneath her head, punched full force by a man half a century younger and twice her size. As sirens wailed in the distance, Derek Walters stood guard over the unconscious form of Eleanor Jackson, his career and freedom bleeding away with every drop of her blood that stained the sidewalk of West Point Harbor. The fluorescent lights in the West Point Harbor Police Department buzzed overhead as Derek Walters sat rigidly in a chair across from Sergeant James Phillips. The small interview room smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, the kind of institutional scent that seemed to permeate every government building. Derek's uniform was still crisp, but his face showed the strain of the past 4 hours, pale, tight around the eyes, a light sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the room's aggressive air conditioning. Phillips, a heavy-set man in his 50s with thinning gray hair and 26 years on the force, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his substantial belly. He just finished reviewing the bodycam footage for the third time, his expression unreadable. "Tell me again what happened, Derek," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Derek swallowed hard. She refused to comply with a lawful order to exit the vehicle. When she finally did step out, she became verbally aggressive. Then she reached for something in her purse, could have been a weapon. "I acted to neutralize the threat." Philip sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Derek, I've known you since you were riding around in your daddy's patrol car. So I'm gonna be straight with you. That footage shows you dragging a 70-something-year-old woman out of her car and then decking her when she talked back to you. There's no reaching for anything, no threatening movements. Just an old lady adjusting her sweater before you put her lights out." Derek's jaw clenched. "The angle of the camera doesn't show everything. She was being defiant, threatening me with complaints. You know how these people operate, Sarge. They're all coached on how to make us look bad." Phillips held up a hand. "Save it. We've got at least 3 civilian videos already circulating online. Close-ups that make your bodycam look like it was shot on a potato. This is bad, real bad. But," he leaned forward, lowering his voice, "we can clean this up. We have before." In the squad room beyond the interview door, Officer Tanya Rodriguez watched the 2 men through the glass partition. At 32, she was one of only 4 women on the force, and its only Latina officer. She had joined the department 5 years ago with idealistic notions about community policing and rebuilding trust between law enforcement and minority communities. Those ideals had been steadily eroded by what she'd witnessed, but never more severely than today. She had been one of the responding officers to Derek's call for backup. Arriving to find Eleanor Jackson unconscious and Derek standing over her, looking shell-shocked. Now Rodriguez watched as Phillips slid a blank incident report form across the table to Derek, along with a statement of events that had clearly been prepared in advance. Her stomach churned with disgust. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, a news alert from the local station. Elderly black woman in critical condition after police encounter. Witness videos showed disturbing footage. Already, competing narratives were emerging. The department's public information officer had released a statement claiming that an elderly suspect became combative during a routine traffic stop, resulting in the use of necessary force to subdue her. Witness accounts on social media told a drastically different story. In the hospital across town, doctors worked frantically to stabilize Eleanor Jackson. The neurosurgeon on call, Dr. Priya Sharma, examined the CT scans with growing concern. "Severe traumatic brain injury with intracranial hemorrhaging," she reported to the team. "These injuries are entirely inconsistent with the officer's report of her falling during a struggle. This woman was struck with extreme force and then suffered secondary impact trauma when her head hit the ground. We need to get her into surgery immediately to relieve the pressure on her brain." As the medical team prepped Eleanor for emergency surgery, a nurse carefully removed her personal effects, including a wallet containing photos, Eleanor in academic regalia receiving a teaching award, Eleanor at her son's military commissioning ceremony, Eleanor with former students at a reunion. On her phone, the last text message read, "Love you, Mom. We'll call next week after the mission. Stay safe. Marcus." Back at the police station, Derek sat alone in the locker room. The reality of what he'd done finally settling in his chest like a block of ice. His hands still ached from the impact. In 12 years of police work, through countless arrests and confrontations, he had never lost control like that. He had drawn his weapon several times, had used his taser twice, had restrained dozens of suspects with necessary force, but he had never punched anyone, let alone an elderly woman posing no physical threat. The department psychologists would probably talk about acute stress reaction or momentary dissociation, but Derek knew the truth. In that moment, when Eleanor Jackson stood tall and dignified, unintimidated by his authority, something primal and ugly had surged through him. The same feeling he'd had as a 10-year-old when his father pointed out those people getting too comfortable at a local restaurant. The same feeling he'd had when he lost the promotion to Lieutenant Williams. The feeling that people who should know their place were forgetting it, and someone needed to remind them. His phone buzzed with a text from Phillips, report filed. Official story, subject became agitated, made threatening movements, resisted lawful commands, and fell during the ensuing struggle. Stick to it. Derek tried to take comfort in the message, in the protection of the thin blue line, but found none. He opened a news site to see shaky cell phone footage of himself, caught in high definition as his fist connected with Eleanor Jackson's face. The comments beneath the video were calling for his arrest, his firing, worse. As Derek drove home that night, the streets of West Point Harbor seemed different, hostile. He found himself checking his rearview mirror more frequently, as if pursued by the consequences of his actions. His apartment, a Spartan one-bedroom in a complex populated largely by other civil servants, offered little comfort. He poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon, then another, watching the continuous news coverage of what they were now calling the Jackson assault. Around midnight his phone rang, Phillips again. Derek answered on the first ring. "We've got a problem," Phillips said without preamble, his voice tight. "This woman isn't just anybody. Her name is Eleanor Jackson. Her son is Admiral Marcus Jackson, Deputy Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. He's been notified and is en route to West Point Harbor as we speak." The glass slipped from Derek's hand, shattering on the floor much like his future was about to. Admiral Marcus Jackson wasn't just any military officer. He was a former SEAL with a legendary reputation, now one of the most powerful men in the Navy's special operations community. And Derek had just put his mother in a coma. "Jesus Christ," Derek whispered, the full implications washing over him in a wave of cold terror. "What do we do?" Phillips's laugh was hollow. "We? There is no we anymore, Derek. The FBI will be taking over the investigation by morning. This just went federal. My advice? Get a good lawyer. The best you can afford." The line went dead, leaving Derek alone with the sound of the television still playing footage of his career, freedom, and life disintegrating in one moment of uncontrolled rage. In her hospital room, Eleanor Jackson lay in a medically induced coma, machines monitoring her vital signs, her prognosis uncertain. The neurosurgery had stopped the bleeding, but the extent of the damage to her brain remained unknown. And 3,000 miles away, aboard a military transport plane now speeding eastward, Admiral Marcus Jackson sat rigid with controlled fury, reviewing the videos of his mother's assault for the dozenth time, already formulating the precise, calculated response that had made him both respected and feared throughout his distinguished military career. What would you do if someone you loved was harmed while you were thousands of miles away? How far would you go to ensure justice was served? If you believe in holding people accountable for their actions, comment number 1 below. If you think the system will protect its own no matter what, comment number 2. And if you're wondering how a decorated military officer will respond when his mother becomes the victim of police brutality, hit that like button and subscribe as we continue this true story of justice and accountability. The C-37A Gulfstream soared through the night sky, its military markings the only indication that this was not just another private jet crossing the American continent. Inside the luxurious but functional cabin, Admiral Marcus Jackson sat alone, his powerful frame rigid with contained emotion. At 52, Marcus cut an imposing figure, 6'3" with broad shoulders, his head shaved clean, dark skin bearing the subtle signs of years spent in the harshest environments on Earth. His dress whites were impeccable despite the hastily arranged flight, 4 gold stripes on his sleeves gleaming under the cabin lights. On the table before him, a secure tablet displayed the same videos that millions of Americans were now watching, his mother being struck down by a police officer half her age. Marcus had been in a classified briefing at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, when his aide had interrupted with an urgent message. Now, just 6 hours later, he was descending toward Charleston International Airport, where a helicopter waited to transport him the final 30 miles to West Point Harbor Memorial Hospital. What the public knew about Admiral Marcus Jackson came from carefully curated Navy press releases. Distinguished graduate of the Naval Academy. Former commander of SEAL Team 6. Bronze Star with Valor. Silver Star. Defense Distinguished Service Medal. What they didn't know, what was classified beyond the reach of even most military personnel, were the operations he had led. The decisions he had made, the precision with which he eliminated threats to national security. In the tight-knit community of special operations, Marcus Jackson's name was spoken with a mixture of respect and unease. He wasn't just good at his job, he was relentless, methodical, and unfailingly just. Those same qualities now focused with laser intensity on the situation in West Point Harbor. As the plane began its descent, Marcus reviewed what he knew. His mother, Eleanor, had been pulled over for a minor traffic violation. The situation had escalated when Officer Derek Walters, Marcus had memorized the name and face, had ordered her from the vehicle without clear cause. When she questioned this, maintaining her dignity and rights, Walters had struck her with enough force to cause a traumatic brain injury. She was now in a medically induced coma following emergency surgery. The prognosis was uncertain. The West Point Harbor Police Department had initially attempted to cover up the incident, filing a falsified report that contradicted multiple video recordings from witnesses and Walter's own body cam. Marcus's jaw tightened as he closed the tablet. His thoughts drifted to his childhood in West Point Harbor, before his appointment to the Naval Academy, before his rise through the ranks. Eleanor Jackson had raised him alone after his father, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Jackson, died during a training exercise when Marcus was just 7, a literature teacher at the local high school. Eleanor had instilled in her son an unshakable moral compass and a deep appreciation for justice. He remembered walking with her during civil rights marches in the 1980s. Her steady presence as they faced hostile counter-protesters. "They fear what they don't understand," she had explained to him. "Your job isn't to fear them back, but to stand so firmly in your truth that they must eventually confront their own." That lesson had guided him through the Naval Academy, where he was one of only a handful of black midshipmen. Through BUD/S training, where instructors pushed him harder than his white counterparts, and through his ascent to flag rank, where the politics grew as treacherous as any battlefield. Now, that same steady voice lay silent in a hospital bed, her brain swollen from an act of senseless violence. The landing gear deployed with a hydraulic whine. Marcus gathered his minimal luggage, consisting of a single duffel bag, a habit from his SEAL days. He had made arrangements with his staff before departing. His schedule was cleared for the next 2 weeks. Command temporarily transferred to his executive officer. This was now his only mission. As the plane touched down, Marcus felt a cold clarity settling over him, the same mental state that had served him in countless operations. Assess the situation. Identify the objectives. Deploy resources. Execute with precision. The helicopter ride to West Point Harbor passed in silence, the pilot wise enough not to attempt conversation with the admiral. Below them, the South Carolina coastline gave way to the lights of the small city where Marcus had grown up. It had changed since his youth, more tourist developments along the waterfront, new shopping centers on the outskirts, but the historic district where his mother still lived looked much the same from the air, its colonial-era street grid illuminated by old-fashioned lampposts. The helicopter landed on the pad atop Memorial Hospital, where the chief of medicine waited, visibly nervous about receiving such a high-ranking military officer. "Admiral Jackson, sir. I'm Dr. Robert Chin. I want to personally assure you that your mother is receiving our absolute best care." Marcus nodded curtly. "Take me to her." The walk through the hospital corridors was brisk, Dr. Chin struggling to keep pace with Marcus's long strides. We've stationed security outside her room, sir, as a precaution. The neurosurgeon, Dr. Sharma, is waiting to brief you on your mother's condition. The ICU was hushed, the beeping of monitors and soft footfalls of nurses the only sounds. Marcus steeled himself before entering his mother's room, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of Eleanor Jackson, always so vibrant and dignified, lying motionless. A breathing tube down her throat, her head partially shaved and bandaged from the surgery, dark bruising visible on her face despite the swelling. For a moment, the Admiral's military bearing faltered. He moved to her bedside with 3 long strides, taking her limp hand in his. "Mom," he whispered, the word carrying the weight of 1,000 emotions. Dr. Sharma, a petite woman with intelligent eyes, waited respectfully before approaching. "Admiral Jackson, I performed your mother's surgery. May I brief you on her condition?" Marcus straightened, his face returning to its controlled expression. "Please." The neurosurgeon didn't sugarcoat the situation. "Your mother suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. The initial impact caused her brain to strike the inside of her skull, creating what we call a coup injury. When she fell, the secondary impact caused a contre-coup injury on the opposite side of her brain, as well as a subdural hematoma, bleeding between the brain and its outer covering. We've relieved the pressure and stopped the bleeding, but there's significant swelling. We've induced a coma to give her brain time to heal." Marcus absorbed this with military precision. "Prognosis?" Dr. Sharma's expression was grave but not without hope. "It's too early to say with certainty. Her age is a factor, but she was in excellent health otherwise. The next 72 hours will be critical. If the swelling subsides, we can begin to bring her out of the coma and assess for damage." Marcus nodded. "Is there anything in your medical assessment that would suggest her injuries came from simply falling during a struggle, as the police report states?" Dr. Sharma's eyes flashed with professional indignation. "Absolutely not. The pattern and severity of injuries are consistent with a direct, high-force blow followed by an unbroken fall to a hard surface. She was struck with considerable force and was likely unconscious before she hit the ground. I would testify to that effect if necessary." "It may be," Marcus replied quietly. He spent several more minutes at his mother's bedside, whispering to her things that no one else could hear, before turning back to Dr. Chin. "I need a secure room where I can make calls and set up a temporary base of operations. I'll be staying here at the hospital." Dr. Chin nodded quickly. "Of course, Admiral. We have a boardroom on this floor that we've prepared for you. My office and staff are at your disposal for anything you need." As they left the ICU, a young nurse approached hesitantly. "Admiral Jackson? I was on duty when your mother was brought in. There's something you should know." Marcus gave her his full attention. "Go on." The nurse glanced around before continuing in a low voice. "The officers who came with her, they were trying to shape the narrative from the moment she arrived. Saying she was combative, that she fell. But I saw the injuries firsthand. And I overheard 2 officers discussing how to get their stories straight before giving statements." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Your name, please?" "Sarah Daniels, sir." "Nurse Daniels, would you be willing to make a formal statement to that effect?" She squared her shoulders. "Yes, sir. I would. Thank you. Someone will be in touch." By morning, Marcus had established what amounted to a military command center in the hospital boardroom. His calls had activated a network of contacts throughout the federal government, the military, and the intelligence community. While the hospital slept, justice was beginning to awaken. At the West Point Harbor Police Department, the night shift had given way to the day, with whispers about Admiral Jackson's arrival spreading through the ranks. Officer Tanya Rodriguez reported for duty with the bodycam footage safely copied to an encrypted drive. She had watched the department's attempted cover-up with growing disgust and had made her decision during a sleepless night. As she changed into her uniform, her resolve hardened. The thin blue line ended where justice began. Across town, Derek Walters finally fell into a troubled sleep as the sun rose. Unaware that the full weight and resources of a military admiral, a man who had hunted America's enemies across continents, were now focused entirely on him. The wheels of justice, so often slow to turn, had been given a powerful push by the arrival of Admiral Marcus Jackson. And in West Point Harbor, a reckoning was coming. What would happen when a man trained to eliminate threats to America turned his attention to threats within the system itself? Would justice prevail, or would the blue wall hold firm? Leave your predictions in the comments below, like this video if you want to see accountability in action, and subscribe to follow this powerful story as it unfolds. The morning sun cast long shadows through the blinds of Derek Walters' apartment as he jerked awake, disoriented and cotton-mouthed from the previous night's drinking. For a blissful moment, consciousness existed without memory, then reality crashed back with nauseating force. Eleanor Jackson. The punch. The videos. Admiral Marcus Jackson. Derek lurched to the bathroom, barely making it before emptying the meager contents of his stomach. Shaking, he splashed cold water on his face and avoided his reflection in the mirror. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the nightstand. Missed calls from Phillips, from the police union rep, from his ex-wife. The last one he returned first. Lisa, hey, her voice cut through, tight with anger. The kids saw the video, Derek. It's everywhere. Aiden's classmates are saying his dad beats up old ladies. What the hell happened to you? Derek closed his eyes, leaning against the wall. It's not what it looks like. She was resisting, and save it, Lisa interrupted. I watched the video. Everyone has. Until this is resolved. I don't want you contacting the kids. My lawyer will be calling yours. The line went dead. Derek stood frozen, phone still pressed to his ear, as another piece of his life crumbled away. His police radio crackled to life with the day's assignments. Despite being the center of a growing storm, no official action had yet been taken against him. The department was circling wagons. Following procedure, administrative leave would require a formal process. Derek dressed mechanically in his uniform, strapping on the badge and gun that had once given him a sense of purpose and pride. Now they felt like props in a play whose final act was racing toward him. At the station, the usual morning bustle felt charged with unusual tension. Conversation stopped when he entered rooms. Some officers made a point of greeting him normally, a show of solidarity. Others found reasons to be elsewhere. Sergeant Phillips beckoned him into his office, closing the door firmly behind them. Phillips looked like he hadn't slept, his complexion gray beneath fluorescent lights. This is bad, Derek. Really bad. The mayor's been calling all morning. The FBI has officially opened a civil rights investigation. They'll be taking over the case by noon. Derek sank into a chair. What about the union? The department? Phillips's laugh was hollow. The union will provide you with representation, sure. But off the record? You're toxic. The bodycam footage is damning. The witness videos are worse. You punched an elderly woman in broad daylight because she talked back to you. His voice dropped. And not just any elderly woman. Admiral Jackson spent 2 hours with the chief this morning. Did you know his mother marched with Dr. King? That she was one of the first black teachers at the integrated high school here? The community is up in arms. There are already protests forming outside. Derek's hands trembled slightly. So what happens now? Phillips leaned forward, his expression shifting from frustration to self-preservation. Now you need to understand something. There is no we in this situation anymore. The department will follow protocol, but nobody's falling on their sword for you. If you try to drag others down by claiming departmental culture or inadequate training, it won't end well. The threat was thinly veiled. Derek stared at his former mentor, understanding the message clearly, take the fall alone. As Derek left Phillips's office, Officer Tanya Rodriguez watched from her desk. The encrypted drive felt heavy in her pocket. Making her decision, she requested personal time for a family emergency and left the station. 30 minutes later, she was being escorted into the makeshift command center at Memorial Hospital where Admiral Jackson had established his base of operations. The Admiral cut an imposing figure in his civilian clothes, a tailored Navy suit that did nothing to diminish his military bearing. His gaze was penetrating as Rodriguez introduced herself. "Sir, I'm Officer Tanya Rodriguez with the West Point Harbor PD. I have something you need to see." She placed the encrypted drive on the table between them. This contains the original, unaltered bodycam footage from Officer Walters, along with audio recordings of conversations between Sergeant Phillips and Officer Walters discussing how to alter reports and create a narrative about your mother being combative. Marcus's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a predator recognizing an opportunity. "Why are you doing this, Officer Rodriguez?" Tanya stood straighter. "Because I took an oath to uphold the law, not to protect officers who abuse their power. What happened to your mother was criminal, and the attempted cover-up makes it worse. There's a culture of racial bias in the department that needs to be exposed." Marcus nodded once, then gestured to a man in a suit who had been quietly observing from the corner. "This is Special Agent Carter with the FBI. I think he'll be very interested in what you have to share." Over the next hour, Rodriguez detailed years of incidents she had witnessed: officers targeting Black and Latino citizens for minor infractions, excessive force incidents swept under the rug, the unofficial but understood policy of closing ranks when complaints were filed. When she finished, Marcus thanked her formally. "You realize this may cost you your job?" Rodriguez's smile was grim. "Some prices are worth paying, sir." Across town, the mayor of West Point Harbor, Catherine Williams, paced her office as her staff briefed her on the rapidly developing situation. A former prosecutor, Williams understood exactly how devastating this case could be for the city. "The liability here is astronomical," her city attorney explained. "We're talking millions in a civil suit, which they will absolutely win. And that's before we consider the federal civil rights implications." Mayor Williams rubbed her temples. "What about the officer? Walters?" Her police liaison shifted uncomfortably. "Still on active duty, ma'am. The department is following protocol for administrative review, but absolutely not," Williams cut in sharply. "I want him suspended immediately. Badge and gun surrendered. Make it clear to the chief that this is not a request. The last thing we need is this officer on the streets while his case is being investigated." By noon, protests had grown outside the police department, with community members carrying signs demanding justice for Eleanor and end police brutality. Local news crews captured the growing unrest, with national outlets picking up the story as the Admiral's involvement became public knowledge. #Justice for Eleanor was trending nationally. In his apartment, Derek watched the coverage with growing despair. His phone rang, the police union representative. "Walters, I'll be straight with you. This doesn't look good. The mayor just ordered your suspension. You need to turn in your badge and gun by end of day. Administrative leave with pay for now, but I'd start looking for a lawyer outside the union council. This is going beyond departmental discipline into criminal territory." After the call, Derek sat in stunned silence. His entire identity had been built around being a police officer, following in his father's footsteps. Without the badge, who was he? His phone chimed with a news alert. A deep dive into his service record had been published online, detailing every complaint ever filed against him, predominantly by Black citizens. The journalist had uncovered patterns that, laid out chronologically, painted a damning picture of escalating bias. Derek's ex-wife had blocked his number. Former friends weren't returning texts. Even his father, retired in Florida, had only said, "You're on your own with this one," before hanging up. As evening fell, Derek received a message from an unknown number. Admiral Jackson knows everything. The unedited footage, the cover-up attempts, your history. He has connections at the highest levels of government. Take a deal while you can. Derek stared at the message, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. This wasn't just about losing his job anymore. This was about prison time. Federal charges. His future destroyed beyond any possibility of rebuilding. Desperate, he tried to reach out to Marcus Jackson through intermediaries. A plea deal, perhaps, or at least a chance to explain himself, to apologize. The response came back unequivocal. Justice isn't negotiable. At Memorial Hospital, Eleanor Jackson showed the first encouraging signs, a slight increase in brain activity, a marginal reduction in swelling. Marcus had arranged for the nation's top neurologist to consult on her case, flying in specialists at his own expense. He divided his time between her bedside, where he read aloud from her favorite books, and his command center, where he methodically built the case against Derek Walters and those who had attempted to shield him. The FBI investigation expanded rapidly, with agents interviewing officers, dispatchers, and administrative staff. They seized computers and phone records, constructed timelines, and built an airtight case documenting not just the assault itself but the coordinated attempt to cover it up. Back at the police station, Rodriguez faced the consequences of her actions. Word had spread that she had turned over evidence to the FBI. Fellow officers stopped speaking to her, left vulgar notes in her locker, and in one case, failed to respond promptly to her call for backup during a routine stop. The Blue Wall was closing ranks, but it was too late. The truth had already escaped. That night, as Derek Walters sat alone in his apartment contemplating the ruins of his life, a knock came at his door. He opened it to find 2 FBI agents with a federal warrant for his arrest. The charges: deprivation of rights under color of law resulting in bodily injury, falsification of records, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. As they led him away in handcuffs, Derek caught sight of news vans already gathering outside his apartment complex. The walls had finally closed in completely, leaving him nowhere to hide from the consequences of his actions. The West Point Harbor Courthouse stood imposingly against the morning sky, its classical columns and broad steps designed to inspire both awe and confidence in the justice system. Today, those steps were packed with protesters, journalists, and curious onlookers as Derek Walters was led inside for his arraignment. Dressed in a suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame, Walters kept his eyes downcast, avoiding the cameras and the shouts from the crowd. Inside, the mood was no less charged. The courtroom filled to capacity within minutes of the doors opening, with court officers struggling to maintain decorum. Judge Evelyn Montgomery, a stern woman with 30 years on the bench, gavelled the room to order. "This court will not become a circus," she announced, her voice carrying authority that immediately silenced the murmurs. "The defendant will rise." Derek stood alongside his attorney, a private lawyer hired after the police union council had advised him to seek outside representation. The charges were read aloud: assault under color of law, civil rights violations, falsifying police reports, obstruction of justice. "How does the defendant plead?" Judge Montgomery asked. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Derek's attorney answered firmly. As the legal proceedings unfolded with their ancient, measured rhythm, the case was exploding across the nation's consciousness. Cable news networks ran the bodycam footage on constant loop, interspersed with expert commentators and side-by-side comparisons with other police brutality cases. The image of Eleanor Jackson, respected teacher, community leader, mother of a decorated admiral, lying unconscious on the pavement became a powerful symbol that transcended typical political divisions. Marcus Jackson had maintained a disciplined silence with the media, but his quiet, constant presence at the hospital and courthouse spoke volumes. When he finally agreed to a single interview with a respected journalist, the nation paused to listen. seated in the hospital conference room that had become his temporary headquarters. Marcus cut a stoic figure in civilian clothes. The interviewer, a veteran journalist with a reputation for fairness, opened with a question about his mother. Admiral Jackson first. How is your mother doing? Marcus's expression softened slightly. She's showing positive signs. The medical team is cautiously optimistic, but she remains in critical condition. The next few days will be crucial. And how would you describe your mother to people who don't know her? The question allowed Marcus to share what the public needed to understand, not just about Eleanor Jackson the victim, but Eleanor Jackson the person. My mother dedicated her life to education and justice, he began, his deep voice measured and controlled. She taught literature in West Point Harbor for over 30 years, mentoring generations of students. She marched for civil rights in the 60s, registered voters in the 70s, and never stopped fighting for a more just community. He paused, the emotion evident beneath his controlled exterior. She raised me alone after my father died serving this country. She taught me that true strength comes from moral courage, not physical force. The irony that she was struck down for displaying exactly that moral courage is not lost on me. The interviewer shifted to the more difficult questions. Some have suggested that your military rank and connections have given this case special attention that other victims of police brutality don't receive. How do you respond to that? Marcus nodded gravely. That's precisely the problem. Justice shouldn't depend on who your son is or what position he holds. Every citizen deserves equal protection and equal justice under the law. My mother's case has received attention because of who I am. But I intend to use that platform to highlight the systemic issues that affect countless others who don't have admirals for sons. The interview continued, with Marcus articulating a powerful vision of accountability and reform. By the time it concluded, social media was flooded with clips and quotes, the hashtag Justice for Eleanor reaching new heights. But it wasn't just Eleanor's story capturing the nation's attention. As the FBI investigation expanded, other victims of Officer Walters came forward with their stories. Terrell Washington, a college student who had been roughly detained for matching the description of a suspect. Maria Gonzalez, pulled over 11 times in a single year without ever receiving a citation. James Carter, a retired veteran pepper-sprayed during a traffic stop when he questioned why he was being ticketed. The pattern was undeniable. And the stories eerily similar. Minor or non-existent infractions escalated through Derek's aggression, particularly toward minorities. Officer Tanya Rodriguez found herself in an unexpected position, vilified by many of her colleagues but increasingly respected by the community and the reformers within the department. Her testimony to Internal Affairs had been comprehensive and damning, detailing not just Derek's history but the culture that had protected and enabled him. The police chief, under mounting pressure from the mayor and city council, announced her appointment to a newly formed community oversight task force. While Derek awaited trial, the district attorney announced expanded charges, upgrading the assault to attempted murder based on the medical evidence of Eleanor's injuries. The police union, initially vocal in Derek's defense, gradually distanced itself as the evidence mounted and public sentiment turned overwhelmingly against him. At the hospital, Eleanor's condition showed steady improvement. The brain swelling had subsided enough for doctors to begin slowly reducing her sedation. Marcus maintained his vigil, dividing his time between his mother's bedside and the systemic response he was helping to coordinate. Former students organized round-the-clock prayer vigils outside the hospital, sharing stories of how Mrs. Jackson had changed their lives through her teaching and mentorship. One evening, as Marcus sat reading one of Eleanor's favorite poems aloud, he noticed a slight movement, her fingers twitching against the sheet. He immediately called for the doctors. Though she remained unconscious, the neurologist confirmed increased brain activity. These are positive signs, Admiral. Very positive. Meanwhile, the mayor's office announced a complete review of police practices, with federal oversight and community input. The Justice Department expanded its investigation beyond Derek Walters to the entire West Point Harbor Police Department, looking for patterns of civil rights violations. The changes were coming faster than anyone had anticipated, propelled by the moral clarity of Eleanor Jackson's case and the determined efficiency of her son, Derek. Now held without bail due to the severity of the upgraded charges, watched these developments on the small television in the detention center's common area. His fellow inmates, having recognized him from the news, maintained a hostile distance. Even here, at the bottom of society's hierarchy, he had found a new low, the cop who punched an old lady. His attorney visited with increasingly pessimistic updates. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence, multiple witnesses, and medical testimony that would be difficult to counter. The best hope was a plea deal, but even that would mean substantial prison time. As Derek considered his rapidly diminishing options, Sergeant Phillips was arrested for obstruction of justice and evidence tampering. The FBI had recovered text messages and emails documenting his role in the attempted cover-up. Not just of Eleanor's case but of numerous excessive force incidents over the years. The blue wall was crumbling, brick by brick. In the wake of Phillips's arrest, the police chief submitted his resignation, acknowledging leadership failures that enabled a culture of impunity. Mayor Williams accepted it immediately and announced a national search for a replacement, with community input on the selection process. The City Council unanimously passed a resolution establishing an independent police oversight board with substantive powers. For the first time in West Point Harbor's history, civilian review of police actions would have teeth. As these systemic changes unfolded, Eleanor Jackson's vigil outside the hospital grew. People brought flowers, candles, and handmade signs. Former students shared how she had encouraged them to attend college, helped them apply for scholarships, stood up for them when no one else would. The story of her life, her quiet, persistent courage in the face of injustice, provided a powerful counter-narrative to the brutal moment captured on video. She was not just a victim. She was a lifelong champion for the very justice now being demanded in her name. And as the seventh day of her hospitalization dawned, Eleanor Jackson opened her eyes. Would you risk everything to stand up for what's right, even when the entire system is against you? Comment number 1 if you believe one person can make a difference in fighting systemic injustice. Comment number 2 if you think the blue wall of silence is too powerful to break. And if you're wondering whether justice will prevail for Eleanor Jackson as this true story reaches its breaking point, hit that like button and subscribe to find out what happens next. The amber glow of sunset filtered through the blinds of Officer Tanya Rodriguez's modest apartment, casting long shadows across the living room. She moved cautiously through her own home, checking locks and windows, a new habit formed since she'd broken ranks with the West Point Harbor Police Department. The threatening notes had escalated to anonymous phone calls, and twice she'd found her car tires slashed. Still, she didn't regret her decision. As she settled onto her couch with a cup of tea, a sharp crash shattered the evening calm, the living room window exploding inward, glass spraying across the floor. Before she could react, the front door splintered open, the frame giving way under a powerful kick. Derek Walters stood in the doorway, his face contorted with rage and desperation, a wild look in his bloodshot eyes. "You ruined my life," he snarled, advancing into the apartment. Rodriguez reached for her off-duty weapon, but Derek was faster, lunging across the room to grab her wrist. "You turned over the footage. You testified against me. Everything I've worked for, gone because of you." His breath reeked of alcohol, his normally neat appearance disheveled. He had made bail that morning after his charges were temporarily reduced through his attorney's maneuvering, a legal technicality that had given him one last taste of freedom. Rodriguez met his gaze steadily despite her racing heart. "You ruined your own life when you punched an elderly woman for no reason. Let go of me, Derek. You're only making things worse for yourself." His grip tightened painfully. "Worse? How could it get any worse? My wife won't let me see my kids. The department has abandoned me. My face is all over the news. I'm looking at 20 years federal time. He pulled her closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. All I need from you is to recant your testimony. Say you were pressured by the Admiral. That you didn't actually see anything wrong in the department. Without your testimony, their case falls apart. Rodriguez struggled to maintain her composure. That's not going to happen, Derek. There are a dozen other officers who know the truth, even if they're too afraid to speak it. The FBI has the evidence. It's over. Something dangerous flashed in Derek's eyes. If I'm going down, I'm not going alone. At the hospital across town, Admiral Marcus Jackson reviewed intelligence reports with a small team of military and FBI personnel. His Naval Intelligence Unit had been monitoring communications between current and former members of the West Point Harbor Police Department since his arrival. A fact known only to the highest levels of the investigation. Sir, we've intercepted concerning communications between Walters and Phillips, a young intelligence officer reported, sliding a transcript across the table. Walters made bail this morning on a technicality. He's been drinking heavily and making threats against Officer Rodriguez. Marcus scanned the document, his expression darkening. Where is Rodriguez now? At her apartment, sir. Alone. Marcus stood immediately. Alert local law enforcement, and send a team to her location now. Phillips is still in custody? Yes, sir. But he's been using his commissary privileges to make calls through third parties. We believe he's been coordinating with Walters, advising him on how to pressure Rodriguez into recanting. Marcus's jaw tightened as he issued rapid-fire orders, mobilizing resources with military precision. Elsewhere in the hospital, Eleanor Jackson's condition had taken a troubling turn. Dr. Sharma hurried into her room, responding to urgent calls from the monitoring staff. Eleanor was experiencing seizures, her fragile brain struggling to manage the trauma it had endured. We need to get her stabilized immediately, Sharma ordered, her team moving with practiced efficiency. The delicate progress of the past days was now threatened by complications that, while not unexpected, were nonetheless dangerous. As medical staff fought to stabilize Eleanor, Marcus divided his attention between his mother's medical crisis and the developing situation with Rodriguez and Walters. In the weeks since his arrival, he had established an intelligence operation that would have been impressive on a battlefield, let alone in a small coastal city. His military connections had given him access to resources and personnel that local law enforcement could only dream of, all focused on achieving justice for his mother and exposing the systemic problems that had enabled her assault. Meanwhile, Derek's confrontation with Rodriguez was escalating. He had forced her into a chair, zip ties cutting into her wrists, as he paced manically before her. I had a good record before all this. Commendations. Respect. My father was on the force for 30 years. This job was everything to me. Rodriguez watched him carefully, looking for an opportunity. Derek, think about what you're doing. Breaking into my home, assaulting a police officer, you're just adding charges. This isn't going to fix anything. Derek laughed bitterly. Fix anything? Nothing gets fixed. The whole system is rigged. You think anything will really change because of this? They'll make a big show of reform, the media will move on to the next story, and everything goes back to normal. Except I'll be in prison, made an example of because I had the bad luck to hit someone important. His ranting was interrupted by his phone buzzing. He checked it, his expression shifting from anger to calculation. Well, looks like I've got a new plan. He showed Rodriguez the screen, a news alert reporting Eleanor Jackson's medical setback. Maybe if there's no victim to testify, this all goes away. Rodriguez felt cold dread spreading through her chest. Derek, don't. Whatever you're thinking, it won't work. The hospital has security, and the Admiral is busy with his mother's condition, Derek cut in. and I know that hospital inside out. Did security details there for years. He yanked Rodriguez to her feet. You're coming with me. Insurance policy. Across town. The police chief's resignation became official as he cleaned out his office under the watchful eyes of FBI agents. The evidence of departmental corruption had proven too extensive to ignore. With dozens of cases of excessive force, falsified reports, and civil rights violations spanning years, Mayor Williams had announced a complete overhaul of the department. With federal oversight and a commitment to community-oriented policing, the community continued to rally around Eleanor Jackson's story. A fundraiser for her medical expenses had raised over $500,000. In just 5 days, though Marcus had redirected the funds to establish a scholarship in his mother's name for students pursuing careers in education and civil rights law. The gathering outside the hospital had grown to hundreds, a peaceful but determined presence that had become a symbol of the community's demand for justice. As night fell, Derek forced Rodriguez into her own car, her service weapon now in his possession. We're going to the hospital. You're going to help me get past security to the Admiral's mother's room. Rodriguez kept her voice level. And then what, Derek? You'll have an Admiral, the FBI, and the entire military hunting you for the rest of your life. Is that your plan? Derek's eyes had a hollow, desperate quality. Maybe there is no rest of my life. Maybe this ends tonight, one way or another. At the hospital, Marcus received the alert that Derek had been spotted entering the parking garage with Officer Rodriguez as a hostage. With cold efficiency, he deployed his team, coordinating with local law enforcement to establish a perimeter while ensuring his mother's room was secured. Sir, his aide approached with urgency. Dr. Sharma reports your mother has stabilized, but she's still in a fragile state. Any disturbance could be dangerous. Marcus nodded once, his mind calculating variables and contingencies as he had done countless times in combat situations. Maintain the security detail on my mother's room. No one gets through without my direct authorization. And get me a direct line to the hospital's security system. Derek and Rodriguez made it to the 3rd floor of the hospital before security identified them. Alarms blared as the facility went into lockdown. Trapped in a service corridor, Derek grabbed a passing nurse and orderly, now holding 3 hostages in a small break room. Nobody moves, he shouted, waving Rodriguez's weapon erratically. I want safe passage out of the country. A plane, money, and immunity, or people start dying. Outside the hospital, SWAT teams established positions as negotiators attempted to establish communication. The media descended en masse, broadcasting the standoff live to a nation already captivated by the unfolding drama of Eleanor Jackson's case. Inside the command center, Marcus watched the security feed, his expression impassive but his mind racing. Years of special operations had taught him to evaluate hostage situations with clinical detachment, to see patterns and weaknesses that others might miss. He observed Derek's increasingly erratic movements, the subtle signs of alcohol withdrawal beginning to manifest, the way he repeatedly checked his phone as if waiting for instructions or updates. Sir, a communications officer interrupted, we've got Sergeant Phillips isolated in county lockup, but he managed one last call before we cut his privileges. We believe he was giving Walters instructions on how to leverage this situation for maximum media impact. Marcus processed this, adding it to his tactical assessment. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with an unstable suspect, multiple hostages, and a volatile environment. Standard procedure would dictate a protracted negotiation, wearing down the hostage-taker while looking for an opportunity to deploy tactical teams. But Marcus Jackson had never been one to follow standard procedure when a more direct approach was available. Get me a direct line to the break room, he ordered. And prepare a distraction on my mark. The standoff had reached its breaking point. For Derek Walters, there was no path forward and no way back. For Tanya Rodriguez, the consequences of her moral courage had escalated beyond anything she could have imagined. And for Marcus Jackson, the mission to obtain justice for his mother had transformed into a tactical operation with lives hanging in the balance. The nation watched, breathless, as the crisis built toward its inevitable climax. How far would a desperate man go when he had nothing left to lose? Would Rodriguez's courage in standing up to a corrupt system cost her life? And would Admiral Jackson's military expertise be enough to resolve a crisis that had become intensely personal? Comment below with your thoughts on how this standoff will end. Like this video to support our coverage of this incredible true story, and subscribe to find out what happens in the dramatic conclusion to this unfolding crisis. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the hospital break room, casting harsh shadows across Derek Walters' sweat-slicked face. 4 hours into the standoff, the small room had become a pressure cooker of fear and desperation. The 3 hostages, Officer Rodriguez, Nurse Amelia Chin, and Orderly James Booker, sat against the wall, watching Derek pace with the nervous energy of a cornered animal. Outside, the hospital corridor had been evacuated, with SWAT teams positioned at strategic points and negotiators attempting to establish a rapport with Derek through the room's phone line. "They're stalling," Derek muttered, peering through the narrow window in the door. "They have no intention of meeting my demands." Rodriguez kept her voice steady, despite the zip ties cutting into her wrists. "Derek, this can still end without anyone getting hurt. Think about your kids. They need their father alive, even if it's from prison." Derek's laugh was hollow. "Prison? Do you know what happens to cops in federal prison? Especially cops famous for assaulting a black woman? I'd be lucky to survive a month." He ran a hand over his face, stubble rasping against his palm. This was never supposed to happen. She just wouldn't listen. Why couldn't she just follow commands like everyone else? The break room phone rang again, the same negotiator who had been calling every 15 minutes since the standoff began. Derek ignored it, his mind racing through diminishing options. The psychological walls were closing in as tightly as the physical ones. Outside the break room, in the hospital's administrative offices, Admiral Marcus Jackson monitored the situation through security feeds and regular updates from the tactical team. He had changed from his naval uniform into tactical gear, his military bearing unchanged by the different attire. "Tell me about Walters," he instructed the FBI psychologist who had been brought in to assess the hostage-taker. Dr. Leslie Winters, a specialist in law enforcement psychology, consulted her notes. Derek Walters, 38, 12 years on the force. His father was also an officer, retired with honors despite multiple excessive force complaints that were buried by the department. Derek grew up idolizing his father and the police brotherhood. His identity is completely enmeshed with being a police officer. Without the badge, he doesn't know who he is. Marcus nodded. "And his current mental state?" Dr. Winters frowned. "Highly unstable. He's been drinking heavily since the incident with your mother, likely self-medicating for anxiety and guilt. He's now in the early stages of alcohol withdrawal, which increases irritability, anxiety, and poor decision-making. The shame of his actions, combined with the public exposure and professional disgrace, has created a perfect storm for suicidal ideation with possible homicidal impulses. He wants to die," Marcus stated flatly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Dr. Winters confirmed. "But he wants his death to have meaning, to be on his terms. He feels victimized by the system, betrayed by his colleagues, abandoned by his family. In his mind, this final act puts him back in control of his narrative." Marcus processed this information with the same analytical precision he applied to battlefield intelligence. "He's waiting for something," he observed, watching Derek check his phone again on the security feed. "Phillips," suggested FBI Special Agent Ramirez, who had been coordinating with the prison. "We've isolated him now, but he managed to get messages out before we caught on." Their communications suggest some kind of contingency plan if Walters got caught. Inside the break room, Derek's phone buzzed with a text message. His expression changed as he read it, a flicker of resolve replacing the desperation. "Time to move," he announced, yanking Rodriguez to her feet. "You first. The others stay here as insurance." Nurse Chen made a small, frightened sound. Orderly Booker moved protectively closer to her, earning a warning gesture with the gun from Derek. "Where are we going?" Rodriguez asked, though she suspected the answer. "To see the Admiral's mother," Derek confirmed. "Since he won't talk to me directly, maybe he'll pay attention when I'm in the same room as his precious mom." Rodriguez's mind raced. Eleanor Jackson's room was in the ICU, heavily guarded and monitored. Derek's plan was doomed to fail, but that made it more dangerous, not less. A man with nothing to lose, believing he was already on his final mission, wouldn't hesitate to take others with him. "Derek, her condition is fragile. Any disturbance could kill her." "Is that what you want? To add murder to the charges?" Derek's eyes had a vacant, distant quality that frightened Rodriguez more than his rage. "The charges don't matter anymore. Nothing matters except making them understand what they've done to me." In the command center, Marcus watched this exchange through the security feed's audio. "He's making his move," he stated calmly. "Prepared to implement Alpha Protocol on my mark." The tactical team leader nodded, relaying the instructions through his comm system. Marcus stepped away briefly, approaching a hospital security terminal. With swift, practiced movements, he bypassed the standard controls, accessing systems that hospital administrators didn't know existed. As Derek forced Rodriguez into the corridor, keeping the gun pressed to her ribs, Marcus gave the order. Simultaneously, every fire alarm in the hospital wing activated, sprinklers engaging throughout the corridors. The sudden chaos, blaring alarms, spraying water, emergency lights flashing, created momentary confusion. Derek instinctively looked up at the sprinklers, his grip on Rodriguez loosening slightly. It was all the opening she needed. Despite her bound hands, Rodriguez drove her elbow hard into Derek's solar plexus, following with a backward head strike that connected with his nose. The gun clattered to the floor as Derek reeled backward, blood streaming down his face. Before he could recover, the corridor filled with tactical officers who secured Derek and freed Rodriguez. The standoff had ended not with the expected violence, but with a precisely executed plan that minimized risk to all involved. In the aftermath, as Derek was led away in restraints, his expression was one of defeated resignation. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the hollow acceptance of a man who had finally run out of options. Rodriguez, being examined by medical staff despite her insistence that she was fine, caught sight of Admiral Jackson observing the scene from a distance. Their eyes met briefly, hers questioning, his acknowledging, before he turned away, returning to his mother's bedside where the real battle continued. The media coverage of the standoff dominated national news cycles, with expert analysis of Derek's actions and psychological state. Political commentators debated the broader implications for police reform and accountability. But beneath the public spectacle, a more personal drama was unfolding in Eleanor Jackson's hospital room. The seizures had subsided, but she remained unconscious, her condition still critical. Marcus sat beside her bed, as he had done every day since his arrival, reading aloud from her favorite book, Toni Morrison's Beloved. His deep voice filled the quiet room with Morrison's powerful words about the legacy of trauma and the possibility of healing. "She was my mother before she was anything else," he told Dr. Sharma during a brief consultation. "Before she was a victim, before she was a symbol, before she became the center of a national conversation about police brutality. She was just my mother, teaching me to be a better man than the world expected me to be." Dr. Sharma nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "The brain is remarkably resilient, Admiral. Particularly when it belongs to someone with your mother's strength of character. Don't lose hope. As the hospital returned to normal operations following the standoff, Derek's ex-wife Lisa arrived. Having watched the crisis unfold on television, she approached Marcus cautiously in the hospital cafeteria, introducing herself with obvious trepidation. "Admiral Jackson, I'm Lisa Walters. I wanted to apologize for what my ex-husband did to your mother. I can't make sense of it. The Derek I knew years ago wasn't this person." Marcus studied her carefully, the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way she clutched her purse strap as if it might anchor her in a world suddenly turned upside down. "Mrs. Walters, you have nothing to apologize for. You're as much a victim of his actions as anyone." Lisa's composure cracked slightly. "Our children, they don't understand what's happening. Their classmates, the things they're saying. How do I explain to my kids that their father did this terrible thing?" Marcus's response was measured, his natural empathy emerging despite the circumstances. "You tell them the truth, appropriate to their age. That their father made a terrible mistake, that he's facing consequences for his actions, and that his choices don't define them." Tears welled in Lisa's eyes. "Thank you. And I truly hope your mother recovers fully." After she left, Marcus returned to the command center, where psychological experts were preparing for what might be the most delicate negotiation yet, a direct conversation between Marcus and Derek. Against the advice of law enforcement, Marcus had requested this meeting, believing it essential to understanding the full scope of what had happened and why. Derek, now heavily sedated and restrained in the psychiatric wing of the county jail, had agreed to the meeting, perhaps seeing it as his last opportunity to explain himself to the man whose family he had irrevocably harmed. The meeting was scheduled for the following day, with extensive security protocols and psychological support in place. That night, as Marcus maintained his vigil at Eleanor's bedside, he noticed a subtle change in her breathing pattern. Her eyelids fluttered almost imperceptibly, her fingers twitching against the sheet. He pressed the call button immediately, bringing the night nurse running. "I think she's responding," he said, hope carefully contained in his voice. The nurse checked Eleanor's vital signs, her expression cautiously optimistic. "I'll page Dr. Sharma. These are encouraging signs, Admiral." As Marcus waited for the doctor, he took his mother's hand gently in his own. "I'm here, Mom," he said softly. "You're not alone. Never alone." In the dim light of the hospital room, with the rhythmic beeping of monitors marking the passage of time, Marcus Jackson, the Admiral, the warrior, the son, allowed himself a moment of pure, unguarded emotion. A single tear traced its way down his cheek as he confronted the possibility that his mother might yet return to him, that justice might be accompanied by healing rather than merely vengeance. Outside the hospital, the media continued their round-the-clock coverage. The protesters maintained their vigil, power, and accountability continued with renewed urgency. Sparked by the image of an elderly teacher lying unconscious after questioning authority, and by the determined response of a son who had brought the full weight of his considerable influence to bear in pursuit of justice. The morning sunlight filtered through the partially drawn blinds of Eleanor Jackson's hospital room, casting gentle patterns across the still figure and the bed. 1 week had passed since the dramatic standoff that had captivated the nation, and subtle but significant changes had begun to manifest in Eleanor's condition. The severe swelling in her brain had subsided considerably, allowing Dr. Sharma and her team to gradually reduce the sedation that had kept Eleanor in a medically induced coma. The breathing tube had been removed 2 days prior, replaced with a less invasive oxygen cannula. Her vital signs had stabilized. Each small improvement meticulously documented in the charts that Marcus reviewed daily with the medical team. Admiral Jackson had established a routine during his vigil, dividing his time between his mother's bedside and the ongoing investigation. Each morning began with a comprehensive medical briefing, followed by updates from the FBI task force and his own intelligence team. The afternoons were dedicated entirely to Eleanor, with Marcus reading aloud from her favorite books. playing the jazz music she had always loved, and simply talking to her about the community's response to her situation. Dr. Sharma entered the room, clipboard in hand, her expression cautiously optimistic. "Good morning, Admiral. I have encouraging news. The latest EEG shows significantly increased brain activity, particularly in response to auditory stimuli. When you were reading yesterday, we observed distinct patterns indicating cognitive processing." Marcus straightened in his chair, carefully controlling his hope. "What does that mean for her recovery?" The neurosurgeon chose her words carefully. "Brain injuries are unpredictable, especially at your mother's age. But these signs suggest she's beginning to emerge from the coma. However," she cautioned, "the road ahead remains uncertain. Even if she regains consciousness, we can't yet determine what lasting effects the trauma might have. There could be memory issues, speech difficulties, motor impairment, or she could make a full recovery," Marcus interjected, his tone not challenging but resolute. Dr. Sharma nodded, respecting his perspective. "Yes, that's also possible. Your mother was in excellent health before the injury, which works in her favor. The next few days will tell us more as we continue reducing sedation." Outside the hospital, the community's support for Eleanor had not wavered. Former students organized a rotation, ensuring that the vigil continued around the clock. They shared stories with reporters about Mrs. Jackson's impact on their lives, how she had stayed after school to help struggling students, used her own money to buy books for those who couldn't afford them, stood up to administrative pressure when the curriculum attempted to whitewash history. One former student, now a state legislator, had introduced a bill requiring enhanced police training on de-escalation and implicit bias, naming it the Eleanor Jackson Act. The West Point Harbor Police Department was undergoing a complete transformation, with the chief's resignation and Sergeant Phillips's arrest. The department's leadership vacuum had been temporarily filled by a respected retired FBI agent specializing in departmental reform, Officer Tanya Rodriguez. Having recovered from her ordeal during the hostage situation, had been promoted to lead a new internal affairs division with expanded powers and civilian oversight. The Justice Department's investigation had uncovered extensive evidence of systemic problems, racial profiling, excessive force, falsified reports, and a culture of retaliation against officers who reported misconduct. The consent decree being negotiated would reshape policing in West Point Harbor for decades to come. Derek Walters remained in custody, denied bail due to the severity of the charges and the danger he presented. His mental health had stabilized under medication and supervision. The alcohol withdrawal symptoms managed by the jail's medical staff. After his meeting with Admiral Jackson, a tense but surprisingly measured conversation that both men had kept private, Derek had stopped fighting the charges. His attorney was now negotiating a plea deal, though the prosecutor, under immense public pressure, was unlikely to offer significant leniency. In Eleanor's hospital room, Marcus continued his daily ritual of reading to his mother. Today he had chosen Maya Angelou's "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings," his deep voice giving weight and resonance to Angelou's powerful words about resilience in the face of racism and injustice. As he read, he noticed a subtle change, Eleanor's fingers twitching against the sheet, more purposefully than the random movements of previous days. He paused mid-sentence, watching intently. Her eyelids fluttered, then stilled. Marcus set the book aside, taking her hand gently. "Mom? Can you hear me?" For a moment, there was no response. Then, almost imperceptibly, Eleanor's fingers curled around his. Marcus pressed the call button immediately, his military composure momentarily forgotten in the surge of hope. Dr. Sharma arrived within minutes, conducting a rapid assessment. "Eleanor? Mrs. Jackson? If you can hear me, can you squeeze my hand?" The response was weak but unmistakable. Dr. Sharma proceeded with additional tests, checking pupillary response, motor function, and basic reflexes. "This is very encouraging," she told Marcus, her professional reserve not quite masking her excitement. She's definitely responding to commands. I'd like to run some additional tests, but it appears she's beginning to emerge from the coma. The next 24 hours brought steady progress. Eleanor's eyes opened briefly, then for longer periods, though she seemed confused and unable to focus. By the following morning, she was tracking movement, her gaze following Marcus as he moved around the room. The medical team expanded, bringing in specialists in neurological rehabilitation to assess her needs and develop a recovery plan. The brain is remarkably adaptable, explained Dr. Chin, the rehabilitation specialist. But recovery is rarely linear. There will be good days and setbacks. The most critical period for recovery is the first 6 months, so we'll want to begin therapy as soon as she's stable enough. Marcus absorbed this information with the same methodical attention he gave to military briefings, asking detailed questions and taking comprehensive notes. His temporary leave from Naval Special Warfare Command had been extended indefinitely, with the full support of his superiors. This was now his mission, and he approached it with the same discipline and determination that had defined his military career. On the morning of the 10th day since the assault, Eleanor Jackson fully regained consciousness. Marcus had stepped out briefly to take a call from the FBI, returning to find his mother's eyes open and alert, following the nurse who was checking her vital signs. "Mom," he said softly, barely daring to hope. Eleanor's gaze shifted to him, confusion giving way to recognition. She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry, her vocal cords weakened from intubation. The nurse quickly provided ice chips to moisten her mouth. "Take it slow, Mrs. Jackson," the nurse advised gently. "You've been unconscious for quite some time." Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for Marcus. He took it immediately, moving closer to the bed. "I'm here, Mom. You're safe now." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as awareness returned, not just of her son's presence, but of her surroundings, her condition, and gradually, the events that had led to it. The doctor had warned Marcus that memory loss was common with traumatic brain injuries, but the recognition and comprehension in Eleanor's eyes suggested her memory remained intact. Unable to speak yet, she squeezed Marcus's hand with surprising strength for someone who had been comatose for 10 days. The medical team converged quickly, conducting assessments and expressing cautious optimism about her cognitive function. Speech therapists were called in, along with physical and occupational therapists, to begin evaluation for the rehabilitation process. By afternoon, Eleanor was able to whisper short phrases, her voice raspy but determined. "How long?" she asked Marcus during a quiet moment between medical visits. 10 days, he answered honestly. "You had us worried, Mom." She nodded slightly, conserving her energy. "The officer?" Marcus hesitated, unsure how much to share in her fragile state. "He's in custody. There will be justice, I promise you." Eleanor's eyes held his, searching for the full truth. Even weakened and recovering, her perception remained sharp. Recognizing this, Marcus provided a simplified but honest account of the developments since her assault, the videos that had captured the incident, the public outcry, the federal investigation, and the changes already underway in the police department. He omitted the details of the hostage situation and his direct confrontation with Derek, judging those stories too stressful for her current condition. Eleanor listened intently, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she whispered, "My students? They've been here every day," Marcus assured her. "Holding vigils, sharing stories about you. The community has rallied around you in an extraordinary way." A small smile touched Eleanor's lips, the first since she had awakened. As her strength gradually returned over the next few days, she progressed from whispering to speaking softly, from ice chips to liquid nutrition, from complete bed rest to sitting up with assistance. The therapists worked with her daily, encouraged by her determination and responsiveness. Though her movements remained weak and uncoordinated, the initial assessments indicated no permanent paralysis, and her cognitive function showed remarkable preservation. Unable to write yet due to motor weakness, Eleanor began communicating through a letterboard, spelling out questions and thoughts when speech became too tiring. On the 4th day of consciousness, as Marcus updated her on the ongoing investigation, she laboriously spelled out a question that caught him by surprise. What happened to that officer? Marcus hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. He's facing multiple federal charges, Mom. He'll likely go to prison for a long time. Eleanor shook her head slightly, clarifying her question by spelling, N-O. Why did he do it? It was a profound question that cut to the heart of the incident, not just the legal consequences, but the human factors that had led a police officer to strike an elderly woman with such force. Marcus considered his answer carefully. He had a history of excessive force complaints, particularly against minorities. The department had a culture of protecting officers like him. When you questioned his authority, stood your ground with dignity instead of fear. Something in him snapped. Eleanor absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. Later that day, with the help of her speech therapist, she managed to communicate more extensively. I want to see the videos, she requested. The medical team advised against it, concerned about the psychological impact, but Eleanor was insistent. I need to understand what happened to me. What's happening around me now? Marcus arranged for a tablet with carefully selected news coverage, staying by her side as she watched the footage of her own assault for the first time. Tears streamed silently down her face as she witnessed Derek Walters' fist connecting with her jaw, her body crumpling to the pavement. She watched the community protests, the interviews with her former students, the national conversation that had erupted around her case. When the videos ended, Eleanor remained quiet for a long time, processing what she had seen. Finally, she looked at Marcus with eyes that held not anger but a profound sadness. Using the letterboard, she spelled out a message that would change the course of everything that followed. I want to see him. 3 months after the assault that had left her in a coma, Eleanor Jackson sat in her wheelchair at the front of the crowded courtroom. Her posture as dignified as it had been throughout her 73 years. The rehabilitation process had been arduous, but remarkably successful. She could now speak clearly, though more slowly than before, and walk short distances with a walker. Cognitive testing showed no significant deficits, though she tired more easily than before the injury. Her appearance in court marked her first public outing since being discharged from the hospital, and the media presence outside the courthouse had been overwhelming. The case of United States v. Derek Walters had become one of the most closely watched trials in recent memory, a focal point for national discussions about police brutality, racial justice, and accountability. The evidence against Walters was overwhelming: multiple video recordings from different angles, medical testimony about the severity of Eleanor's injuries, a documented history of excessive force complaints, and the testimony of fellow officers about the attempted cover-up. Derek sat at the defense table, a shadow of his former self. The aggressive confidence that had once defined his bearing was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed resignation. He barely responded as his attorney made last-minute preparations for the proceedings. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Montgomery entered and called the court to order. Before we begin final arguments, the judge announced, the court has received an unusual request. Mrs. Eleanor Jackson has asked to address the court directly. Murmurs rippled through the gallery as Eleanor's wheelchair was guided to the designated area by Marcus, who had rarely left his mother's side throughout her recovery. Mrs. Jackson, Judge Montgomery said, her tone respectful, while this is somewhat unconventional at this stage of proceedings. Given the extraordinary circumstances of this case, the court will hear your statement. Please proceed when you're ready. Eleanor thanked the judge with a slight nod, then turned to face the courtroom. Her voice, though softer than in her teaching days, carried clearly in the hushed space. I've spent my life in classrooms, she began, teaching young people about literature, about history, about the power of words to illuminate the darkest corners of human experience. Today, I find myself in a different kind of classroom. One where the lesson is being written as we speak. She paused, gathering her strength before continuing. 3 months ago, Officer Derek Walters struck me with enough force to cause a traumatic brain injury because I questioned his authority. Because I stood in my dignity, as a human being deserving of respect. Because, fundamentally, he saw my black skin and my questioning as a threat to his power. Eleanor's gaze shifted to Derek, who couldn't meet her eyes. I've had a lot of time to think during my recovery. To consider the long history of similar incidents that didn't have the benefit of video recordings or public outrage. To remember the countless Black Americans who have suffered similar fates without the protection of having an admiral for a son. The courtroom remained utterly still as she continued. What happened to me isn't just about one officer losing control. It's about systems that protect those who abuse power. It's about a culture that teaches some people that their authority should never be questioned, especially by those who look like me. It's about the fear that transforms a 73-year-old teacher into a threat requiring violence to subdue. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. The damage from Officer Walters' action was not limited to my brain. It extended to his own life, to his family, to his colleagues, to our community. Violence always creates ripples far beyond its initial impact. She took a deep breath before delivering the most surprising portion of her statement. I believe in justice. But I also believe that justice without humanity becomes mere vengeance. I do not want Officer Walters to receive the maximum possible sentence as some form of retribution. What I want is for him to understand the full impact of his actions, to take responsibility for the harm he has caused, and to commit himself to becoming part of the solution rather than perpetuating the problem. Gasps and whispers filled the courtroom. Derek looked up, confusion evident on his face. Eleanor continued, addressing him directly now. Hate damaged you long before it led you to damage me. Breaking this cycle requires more than just punishment. It requires healing, education, and a commitment to change. I hope you will use whatever time the court determines you must serve to reflect deeply on the choices that brought you here, and to prepare yourself to make different choices in the future. As Eleanor concluded her statement, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of reactions, some moved to tears, others clearly disagreeing with her call for measured justice. Judge Montgomery gavelled for order, thanking Eleanor for her statement before proceeding with final arguments. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty on all counts. 2 weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, Judge Montgomery acknowledged Eleanor's statement. The court has rarely witnessed such grace and wisdom from someone who has suffered as Mrs. Jackson has. Her call for justice tempered with humanity has been given serious consideration. Derek Walters was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with mandatory participation in racial bias education and conflict resolution training. The judge also ordered that upon release, he would serve an additional 5 years of community service working with organizations focused on police reform and racial reconciliation. In the months that followed, the ripple effects of the case continued to spread. The West Point Harbor Police Department underwent a complete transformation under federal oversight and new leadership. Officer Tanya Rodriguez was promoted to captain, tasked with implementing the reforms mandated by the consent decree. The Eleanor Jackson Foundation, established by Marcus with the donations that had poured in during his mother's hospitalization, began awarding scholarships to students pursuing careers in civil rights law and education. Eleanor herself, continuing her remarkable recovery, declined numerous speaking invitations and book offers. Instead, she focused her energy on a more direct approach. Working with police departments across the country, she developed workshops on racial bias and community relations, using her own experience as a teaching tool. I was an educator before this happened, she explained to Marcus when he questioned whether the work might be too strenuous. I remain an educator now. But the classroom has changed. And the lesson is more urgent. 1 year after the assault, Eleanor visited Derek Walters in prison. The meeting, arranged through her attorney and approved by the Bureau of Prisons as part of Derek's rehabilitation program, took place in a small conference room rather than the standard visitation area. Derek entered in his prison uniform, thinner and grayer than he had been at trial. He stopped short upon seeing Eleanor, uncertainty and shame evident in his posture. "Mrs. Jackson," he acknowledged quietly, taking the seat across from her. "Thank you for seeing me." Eleanor studied him carefully before responding. "How are you, Mr. Walters?" The simple question, delivered without irony or accusation, seemed to catch Derek off guard. "I'm surviving," he answered hesitantly. "The racial bias education program you recommended has been challenging." "Eye-opening." Eleanor nodded. "Learning to see beyond our own limited perspectives is always challenging. It's supposed to be." Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, moving from awkward formality to a more genuine exchange. Derek spoke about his children, now living with his ex-wife in another state, visiting only rarely. He talked about the anger management and therapy sessions he had initially resisted but now valued. Eleanor shared stories from her teaching career, including the challenges she had faced as one of the first black teachers in a newly integrated school. "I chose to visit you today," Eleanor explained near the end of their meeting, "because healing cannot happen in isolation. What occurred between us that day on the street was the product of centuries of history, of systemic failures, of personal choices. The healing must be equally complex and interconnected." Derek nodded, his eyes revealing a depth of understanding that had been absent a year earlier. "I can never undo what I did to you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I want you to know that I'm trying to understand why I did it. To make sure I never become that person again." "That," Eleanor replied simply, "is the beginning of justice." 2 years after the assault, on a bright spring morning, Eleanor Jackson stood with the assistance of a decorative cane at the dedication of a community garden in her name. The Eleanor Jackson Community Garden had been established on a formerly vacant lot in the historically black neighborhood where she had lived for decades. The garden would serve as both a source of fresh produce for local families and an educational space for schools. Marcus stood beside his mother, now retired from active duty and working with the Eleanor Jackson Foundation full-time. Captain Rodriguez was there as well, along with many of Eleanor's former students and members of the reformed police department. As Eleanor cut the ribbon to officially open the garden, she reflected on the journey from that fateful traffic stop to this moment of community healing. The physical injuries had largely healed, though she would always walk with a slight limp and tire more easily than before. The deeper wounds, to the community, to the concept of justice, to the relationship between citizens and those sworn to protect them, were healing more slowly but with promising progress. From violence came voice, she told the gathered crowd. From injury came insight. From trauma came transformation. This garden represents what can grow when we commit ourselves to nurturing justice and reconciliation with the same care we give to these plants. As the attendees dispersed to explore the garden, Eleanor took Marcus's arm, walking slowly among the newly planted beds. "Are you happy with your decision to retire?" she asked her son, who had ended his military career to focus on the Foundation's work. Marcus looked down at his mother, the woman who had shaped his moral compass from his earliest days. "I served my country in uniform for 30 years, he replied. "Now I'm serving it in a different way. Both feel like purpose." Eleanor smiled, satisfaction evident in her expression. The story that had begun with a punch thrown in anger had transformed into something profound, a reckoning with systemic injustice, a model for accountability and reform, and ultimately, a testament to the power of justice tempered with mercy. As she looked around at the garden blooming with new life, Eleanor Jackson felt a deep sense of peace. The painful journey had led to this place of growth and renewal, where the seeds of change were taking root in fertile ground. What do you think about Eleanor's decision to advocate for rehabilitation rather than maximum punishment? Would you have shown such forgiveness in her position? Comment below with your thoughts on justice and mercy. If this story moved you and you believe in the power of transformation, please like this video. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories, and share this with someone who needs to hear a message of hope today. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through darkness into light. This story illustrates the complex interplay between power, race, and justice in America. When Officer Derek Walters struck Eleanor Jackson, he revealed not just personal prejudice, but a system that enabled his actions through silence and protection. Eleanor's journey reminds us that true justice requires both accountability and mercy. While Derek faced consequences for his actions, Eleanor recognized that punishment alone wouldn't heal the deeper wounds of racism and abuse of power. The transformation of the West Point Harbor Police Department demonstrates how individual incidents can catalyze systemic change when met with determination and moral clarity. Admiral Marcus Jackson's methodical pursuit of justice shows that change often requires both inside and outside pressure on institutions resistant to reform. Officer Rodriguez's courage reminds us that speaking truth to power, while difficult, is essential for progress. Perhaps most powerful is Eleanor's choice to transform her trauma into education, using her experience to create understanding rather than division. Her ability to see Derek's humanity while demanding accountability represents the delicate balance true justice requires. In the garden's growth from barren ground, we see the possibility of renewal after harm, not through forgetting, but through purposeful nurturing of something better. What would you do if faced with injustice like Eleanor experienced? Would you have the courage to stand firm like Officer Rodriguez, or the strength to show mercy like Eleanor did after recovering? Comment below with how you think you would react in a similar situation. If this story touched you or made you think differently about justice, please hit that like button to help others find it. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that challenge our perspectives and open important conversations about society. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that justice and healing can coexist. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of America's most challenging issues. The path to a more just society isn't easy, but stories like Eleanor's show it's possible when we combine accountability with compassion.